Hello and welcome. In August 2019, news channels around the world briefly made headlines with an event that was almost universally considered indecent. The US president reportedly inquired about the possibility of purchasing Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. The reaction was harsh. Late-night television hosts ridiculed the idea as a grandiose notion, the fantasy of a real estate developer thrown onto sovereign territory. The Danish Prime Minister dismissed the idea as absurd, and for weeks social media was flooded with memes of golden towers perched atop fishing villages in GIUK. But nobody was talking about it at the Pentagon, at NATO headquarters in Brussels, or in the People's Liberation Army's strategic planning committees in Beijing. While the way the proposal was presented was unusual, the geopolitical logic behind it was not only sound, but also consistent with over 150 years of American grand strategy. The media treated the idea as a sudden aberration, but history tells a different story. The 2019 proposal was nothing more than a public reemergence of a quiet, desperate truth known to military planners for decades. The world map is being redrawn, and the island at the top of the globe is no longer a frozen periphery. It is becoming the center. To understand why the world's superpowers are secretly encircling this region, we must set aside political events and look at the Arctic through the lens of military geography, resource scarcity, and the return of great power competition. We are witnessing the end of the post-Cold War era and the beginning of a new struggle for the roof of the world. In this struggle, Greenland is not just an island, it is the most strategically valuable region on Earth. The United States' interest in seizing Greenland did not begin in the 21st century. Immediately following the American Civil War, it began under the guidance of a man whose vision of American power extended far beyond the continental frontier. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward organized the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire. History remembers this as Seward's folly. This criticism only disappeared when gold was discovered in the Klondike. But for Seward, Alaska was only the first step. In the late 1860s, Seward and the State Department operated under the pretext of a specific naval control. In the age of steam, a navy was only as effective as its network of coal supply stations. A fleet unable to refuel was a fleet unable to project power. Seward specifically requested the State Department to prepare a report analyzing Greenland's resources and strategic location. The logic was clear. If the United States controlled Alaska in the west and Greenland in the east, it would effectively constitute the North American continent. The Arctic would become an American lake, and the North Atlantic would be secured against European war. Although the purchase was never officially completed in 1867 due to internal restructuring and political fatigue, preparations were underway. The State Department acknowledged a fundamental fact. Greenland is like the geological gateway to the North Atlantic. It dominates the approach to Canada and the United States. For the next 70 years, this idea lingered, remaining a theoretical objective in the archives of American diplomacy. But as technology advanced from steamships to long-range bombers, the distance between continents shortened, and the strategic calculation changed overnight. By 1946, the world had been shattered and reshaped by World War II. Major powers had been defeated, but a new, colder war was brewing with the Soviet Union. President Harry S. Truman, then at the head of the only nuclear-armed nation in the world, looked at the map and saw a terrible vulnerability. The Soviet Union possessed bombers capable of crossing the Arctic Circle. In a potential Third World War, the attack would not come across the Atlantic or the Pacific, it would come across the Arctic. This awareness led to one of the 20th century's most audacious and least understood diplomatic moves. In 1946, in strict secrecy, the Truman administration made a formal offer to the Danish government to purchase Greenland. The price was $100 million, to be paid in gold bars. Given the inflation and the relative size of the economy, this was a massive transfer of wealth. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had concluded that Greenland, in their own words, was indispensable to the security of the United States. They considered the island to be the world's largest stationary aircraft carrier. From bases in Greenland, American bombers could reach the industrial heart of the Soviet Union,
while radar stations on the ice could provide the critical warning minutes needed to intercept incoming Soviet waves. Denmark, struggling with reconstruction after Nazi occupation, considered the offer but ultimately rejected it. The rejection was not economic. It was a matter of national honor and a recognition of their moral obligations toward the Inuit population. But this rejection did not end the American presence. It only changed the terms. If Washington couldn't acquire the land, it would lease the geography. This led to the 1951 Greenland Defense Treaty, which effectively placed the island under NATO protection and paved the way for the construction of Thule Air Force Base, now known as Pituffik Spaceport. Greenland's description as an unsinkable aircraft carrier is not merely a metaphor, it's an explanation of its physical utility in the nuclear age. Situated between Moscow and Washington, D.C., the island eliminates the difficulty of distance. A ballistic missile launched from the Russian interior takes approximately 30 minutes to reach targets on the U.S. mainland. The curvature of the Earth dictates that these missiles must fly over the Arctic. This makes Greenland the absolute front line of American missile defense. Located high above the Arctic Circle, Pituffik Space Base is home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron. Its primary asset is a massive solid-state phased array radar system. This system continuously scans the northern horizon, detecting objects thousands of miles away in space. This system is the heart of the American nuclear shield. Without this facility, the United States would be effectively blind to a first strike on the polar region until the warheads re-entered the atmosphere over Canada. The strategic value here is twofold. You either control this geography or you are defenseless. There is no middle ground. Beyond the threat of air and orbital bombardment, Greenland determines the flow of power across the Atlantic Ocean via a maritime corridor known as the GIUK passage. This abbreviation stands for Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, referring to specific areas of the open ocean between these three landmasses. For naval strategists, the GIUK passage is the most crucial strait in the maritime history of the last century. During the Cold War, the Soviet Navy's Northern Fleet was based in Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula. To threaten NATO supply lines in the Atlantic or to deploy nuclear-armed submarines off the American coast, Soviet ships needed to pass through the GIUK Strait. This strait, then as now, serves as a funnel. NATO exploited this by equipping the seabed with the SOSUS sound surveillance system. These hydrophone arrays listen to the unique acoustics of Soviet submarines. Because the strait is relatively narrow compared to the open ocean, it allowed NATO to concentrate its anti-submarine warfare assets, ships, maritime patrol aircraft, and hunter-killer submarines, in a layered kill zone. Greenland forms the western leg of this strait. If an enemy force were to gain military access to Greenland's ports or airfields, it would effectively blockade the strait. They would remain behind a wall. Today, as the Russian Federation revitalizes its submarine fleet with silent, deep-diving Severodvinsk-class submarines, the Sky Gateway has returned to the forefront of NATO planning. The Atlantic has once again become a contested area, and its security depends entirely on the political orientation of Nuuk and Copenhagen. American desperation to secure this region led to one of the strangest and most dangerous engineering projects of the Cold War, an undertaking that demonstrates how far the military was willing to go. In 1959, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction of Camp Century. The publicly presented scenario was that it was a scientific research station dedicated to testing construction techniques in polar environments. In reality, it was a secret program known as Project Icewolf. Project Icewolf aimed to build a vast network of mobile nuclear missile launch sites beneath the Greenland ice sheet. The plan envisioned thousands of miles of tunnels powered by portable nuclear reactors and housing hundreds of Iceman missiles. These missiles were to be constantly moving in underground railway wagons, making them impossible for the Soviet Union to target. It would be a nuclear deception game played under the glaciers. The project failed not because of Soviet interference, but because of the ice itself. The engineers underestimated the glacier's resistance. The ice sheet was alive, constantly moving and deforming. The tunnels began to bend and collapse, crushing the infrastructure. By 1967, the base was abandoned, leaving behind biological waste, fuel, and low-level radioactive coolant, all buried under the snow. For decades, it was assumed that this toxic legacy would remain buried forever. But Project Icewolf revealed just how far the Pentagon would go to exploit Greenland's geography, treating the island not as a country, but as a platform for weapon systems. But today, the fundamental driving force behind Greenland's strategic evolution is not just the legacy of the Cold War, but the physical transformation of the planet. The Arctic region is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. This is not a political debate in military circles, it is an operational reality. The ice is receding, revealing two things that great powers covet: access and resources. For much of human history, the Arctic Ocean was a barrier, a frozen wall protecting North America and isolating Russia. Now that wall is melting. The retreat of sea ice is opening up the northern sea route along the Russian coast and the northwest passage through the Canadian archipelago. These routes are the holy grail of global logistics. A container journey from Shanghai through the Suez Canal to Rotterdam takes approximately 35 to 48 days. With a trans-Arctic route, this time could be shortened by up to 40%. Greenland is situated at the intersection of these future superhighways. As the ice recedes, Greenland's deep water fjords will become the potential Singapores and Dubais of the north, vital hubs for refueling, transshipment, and repair. Control of these ports would also mean control of the trade routes themselves. This potential has not escaped the attention of the People's Republic of China. In 2018, China published a white paper declaring itself a near-Arctic state. While the term has no basis in international law, it demonstrates Beijing's intentions. China has no coastline in the Arctic, but it has identified the region as a critical frontier for its Polar Silk Road initiative. Beijing's strategy is not to occupy with troops, but to integrate with infrastructure. Chinese state-owned companies have aggressively pursued investment in Greenland, proposing to build international airports, improve port facilities, and invest in mining operations. This economic state-led approach has set off alarm bells in Washington. In 2018, when it became clear that a Chinese state-owned company was about to win the bid to build new airports in Greenland, the U.S. Department of Defense intervened. Pressure was exerted on the Danish government, and eventually, Denmark effectively prevented critical dual-use infrastructure from falling into Chinese ownership by funding the projects itself. The logic was simple. An airport built by China in Greenland could theoretically be used by Chinese military transport planes, complicating the defense of the North American continent. But China's interest isn't limited to logistics. It's also driven by what lies beneath the rocks. As glaciers retreat, they are revealing one of the world's most important critical mineral deposits. We are transitioning from a hydrocarbon-powered global economy to an electron-powered one. This green transition relies on a specific set of raw materials, rare earth elements: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. These are components of modern life. They are essential for electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, and guidance systems for precision-guided munitions. Currently, China controls the vast majority of the global rare earth element supply chain, from mining to processing. This monopoly exerts strategic pressure on Western industry and defense production. The F-35 fighter jet, the backbone of NATO air power, requires approximately half a ton of rare earth elements. If Beijing were to cut off supplies, Western military production would come to a complete standstill. This is where Greenland becomes the trillion-dollar question. The Kvanefjeld deposit in southern Greenland is estimated to contain one of the world's largest concentrations of rare earth oxides, along with significant uranium deposits. Estimates of the mineral wealth hidden in Greenland's geology vary considerably, but its strategic value is immeasurable. It represents the only viable alternative to China's supply dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The entity controlling mining rights in Greenland controls the fuel of the 21st century economy. However, the extraction of these resources brings us to the most complex variable in the equation: the Greenlandic people and their unique political status. Greenland is not a colony in the traditional sense, nor is it a fully sovereign state. It is a self-governing region within the Kingdom of Denmark. Since the enactment of the Autonomy Act of 2009, Greenlanders have had the right to self-determination. They can vote for independence at any time, but there is a problem. Greenland's economy is heavily supported by a large grant from Denmark, accounting for more than half of the government budget and roughly 20% of GDP. Independence would mean the loss of this funding. To compensate for this, an independent Greenland would need urgent and substantial sources of income. The only viable source is mining. This creates a paradox that foreign powers are eager to exploit. An independent Greenland would be a microstate of 57,000 people, dependent on capital, sitting on a treasury. This makes it incredibly vulnerable to debt-trap diplomacy. If the United States doesn't step in as the primary economic partner, another power will. This is a nightmare scenario for the Pentagon. An independent Greenland leasing its ports and mines to a strategic rival out of economic necessity. This dynamic is further complicated by Greenland's internal politics. The vast majority of the population is Inuit, and there is a strong and growing movement for full independence. But there is also a deep environmental awareness. In Greenland, the 2021 elections, particularly the victory of a party campaigning against uranium mining in Kvanefjeld, effectively halted the massive rare earth elements project. This demonstrates that the people of Greenland are not passive pawns on a chessboard. They are active players capable of halting the geopolitical ambitions of superpowers with a single parliamentary vote. We are currently in the early stages of an Arctic Cold War. This is a conflict defined not by tank units or trench lines, but by icebreaker ships, scientific expeditions, and consular presence. Russia has responded to the changing climate by remilitarizing its northern coast, reopening Soviet-era bases, and deploying advanced radar and missile systems. They view the Northern Sea Route as their internal waterway and demand that foreign vessels request permission and pay transit fees, a stance challenged by the U.S. under Operation Freedom of Navigation. NATO, meanwhile, has responded by increasing its operational tempo in the north. In exercises like Trident Juncture, tens of thousands of soldiers trained in Scandinavian conditions, preparing them specifically for conflicts in the Arctic environment. The United States reestablished a consulate on Nuuk for the first time since the 1950s and provided millions of dollars in civilian aid to the island. This is soft power with a hard side. It signals to the public that Washington is a viable partner, an alternative to Copenhagen or Beijing. The period that follows will be one of intense but quiet transition. It is unlikely that the United States will purchase Greenland in a transactional sense. The era of sovereign territorial transfers among Western democracies is largely over. Instead, Washington will pursue an overwhelming integration strategy. We will see increased U.S. investment in Greenland's civilian infrastructure, more educational exchanges, and perhaps eventually the establishment of a free relations agreement similar to the one the U.S. has with Pacific Island nations like Palau or Micronesia. The goal is to create such a tight sphere of influence that legal sovereignty becomes a technical detail. The United States cannot allow Greenland to drift. The physics of missile defense and the economics of rare earth minerals dictate that Greenland must remain firmly within the North American security architecture. If diplomacy fails, pressure will mount. The Arctic is too central to the future of American power to be left to chance. In 2019, headlines about buying Greenland were dismissed as a joke, a momentary lapse in diplomatic courtesy. But in retrospect, they were a radical moment. They stripped away the polite veneer of international relations, revealing the raw strategic calculation underlying it. Nations have no friends, they have interests, and as the ice melts, the interests of the world's superpowers converge on this vast island. Greenland is no longer a separate entity, it's a turning point. The history of the next century will likely be written in the Arctic, and its ink will be the flow of trade, the extraction of minerals, and the positioning of military presence in the north. When the idea of buying was floated, the world laughed, but as the geopolitical temperature rose, along with the physical temperature, the voices in the head fell silent. The scramble for the Arctic has begun, and Greenland is the prize. This reality forces us to confront a harsh truth about the modern world. We often assume the map is complete, the borders are fixed, and the age of expansion is over. But geology and climate don't respect our assumptions. As the environment changes, so does the strategic value of the land. A A frozen wasteland in 1900 becomes a vital command center in 1950 and a wealth of resources in 2030. The United States, Russia, and China are locked in a three-way battle for position, with Greenland's Inuit population at the center of the storm. Decisions made in GIUK, Washington, and Copenhagen in the coming years will determine who controls the northern approaches to the Western Hemisphere. It's a high-stakes game of chess played on melting ice, and Greenland is the queen in this game. Strategic planners often look for historical parallels to understand the present. In the 19th century, the great game was played in Central Asia. In the 20th century, the focus shifted to Central Europe and the Pacific coast. In the 21st century, the great game is moving north. The buyout was not a setback. It was a signal. The Arctic is open to trade, and the struggle for control will determine the future of global security. The ice is melting, and with it, the old world order is disappearing. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you again tomorrow.